Clark is in St. Louis, the year 1807, the spring of '07. An expedition is coming upstream. Heading this expedition is Manuel Lisa, who at the time controlled a lot of the fur trade in St. Louis. With Lisa, George Drouillard, the former hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition. With Lisa, John Potts. And William Clark himself has invested cash in this expedition to capitalize on the fur trade. They're coming upstream. They're a ways downstream from the Mandan villages. And lo and behold, they see one lone white man, spring of 1807, coming downstream in a canoe. And it's John Colter. Now, we do have some idea of what happened to Dixon and Hancock, but a lot of it is conjecture. Dixon and Hancock, some people say they had a falling out. Some people say they had a falling out with John Colter. But regardless, Dixon and Hancock, they're in the past, and they did not journalize. Colter is coming downstream. He encounters the Lisa expedition. He encounters his old friends from the expedition. It's not even a year later. And they all visit. Colter, how'd you winter? Well, I made it. How about you guys? I kept my top knot. I kept my hair on. In other words, he wasn't killed by the Blackfeet. And what about you guys? Well, we're going up to capitalize on the fur trade. And certainly Drouillard, Weiser, and Potts would have vouched for the integrity of John Colter. And even Colter himself would have talked about what he had encountered. Lisa stakes him. Lisa invites him to come with him. He's going to need gunpowder. He's going to need new lead for what his gun shoots. He's going to need a stack of traps. And so he turns around once again. And he would have been quite a distance, almost to St. Louis when he did this. It would not have been a big deal to keep going downstream to St. Louis. Once again, he turns around. Considering he'd only been out there for the winter and he's by himself, he could not have been carrying any significant amount of beaver, though I'm sure he had some. They come back upstream. They go up the Yellowstone River. Would that have been at the suggestion of John Colter? There's a good chance. Would that have been because Colter is saying, and some of the members of the expedition know this, of this Lisa expedition know this now, shorter distance to the Three Forks. They go up the Yellowstone River, and at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone River, they establish Fort Ramon. Now you see this published in many different ways. Fort Raymond, Fort Ramon, Fort Lisa, Fort Emmanuel, Fort Manuel. We see all these different terms used to describe this fort at the junction of the Bighorn and Yellowstone. But we know from Lisa's own journals that he named it after his firstborn son, Ramon. I tend to call it Fort Ramon, but you may hear me use other terms as I continue to tell you some of these events that took place. It's the spring of 1807. They establish a fur trading post at the junction of the Bighorn River and the Yellowstone River, which, by the way, this would have been the first structure constructed in what is now the state of Montana by Euro-American invaders, if you will, because this is Native American country. They were in the landscape of the Crow, who they got along with, and they were in the land, though they hadn't spent much time with them at that point in time, and they were in the landscape of numerous other Native American tribes. Regardless, they established that fur trading post. It's the spring of '07. In the fall of 1807, Manuel Lisa says to George Drouillard, Drouillard, you head south and east. Colter, you head south and west. Make contact with all the Crow Nation. Make contact with all the Indian tribes you encounter. Let them know about our fur trading post here. Tell them to bring their furs here. I'm going back to St. Louis. I'm going to go get the more blue beads, red beads, blue cloth, red cloth, more tobacco, some alcohol, some more traps, more lead, more powder. I'm going to get thimbles so that it's easier for the natives to sew. I'm going to get awls for punching holes in leather. I'm going to get bells. I'm going to get these trade goods that we know these people want. Metal cooking kettles. You know, they would take metal whiskey barrel hoops and flatten them out. And it was an easy way to transport metal that the natives could then heat up and cut into pieces and use for spear points, arrowheads, knife blades, tomahawks. So they basically were going back for trade goods. And by the way, when I mentioned blue beads, red beads, these were not common items in knives. tomahawk, metal tools. These were a big deal for the natives. And they wanted these things. Again, when it came to the fur trade, to ally themselves with the whites could be a good thing because they wanted, and as far as they were concerned, needed these trade goods. Keeping in mind, by the way, to some extent, when they buy into the white man's economy, they buy into dependence to some extent on that economy. And whiskey is always going to be part of that. And so this is a poison for many of the natives. Some of the natives, when Lewis and Clark offer a dram on their way upstream, they didn't give them a lot. They knew it could be a hazardous thing to do, but when they offered, some of the natives thought, why are you giving us this? Should we trust you? Because we know when we drink this stuff, it makes us foolish. We've seen it happen to our brethren. So there's no doubt about it. There's difficult cultural things going on here. There's difficult issues associated with that. But regardless, they do want those tools. So Lisa heads out in the fall of '07. He's going back to St. Louis. Drouillard heads south and east. Colter heads south and west. And it's at that time that John Colter made his foray through some part of what is now Yellowstone National Park. In the wintertime, '07-'08, departing by himself, probably carrying a buffalo robe and samples of trade goods, his buffalo robe being his shelter, and of course, a tomahawk or hatchet, a knife, and his gun. And his job was to make contact with mostly the Crow, because that was the landscape of the Crow, the Absoluca. Make contact with the Crow, tell him about the fur trading post at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone. I have to agree, it's with many people who are familiar with the story, is a monumental physical feat, but at the same time, quite the adventure. And he went on so many of these little forays and jaunts through the western landscape that I'm sure he just loved it. He had an aptitude for it. He had the skills necessary. He had the ability to endure the hardships required of travel in this rugged, mountainous landscape. Places like this, we're on the edge of a canyon. We happen to be close to some pretty rugged terrain. Finding his way. Where's the best place to cross the Yellowstone River? Where's the best place to cross the multitude of rivers that he must have encountered? It would have been spectacular. In addition, I do think that he had a lot of clues and probably assistance. He probably followed animal trails. I happen to be standing on what's a trail for bighorn sheep. He could have been following bison roads, as they were often referred to. And certainly he could have had natives tell him about these preferred routes, the most efficient routes on the landscape, because his mission was to interact with the Native Americans. His mission was to encourage them to trade with the white men. A lot of people are, they're just astonished that Colter did this, that he did this foray by himself, and people often talk about him doing it by himself. But keep in mind, his mission was to make contact with various settlements of natives. And so when the weather got really bad, I'm sure he just simply stayed with them, just simply stayed, in a village. And of course, in general, they wanted to ally themselves with the whites for purposes of trade, the natives did. And Colter obviously was something of a diplomat. He could communicate well with the natives. By now he's been living out here for a long time. He knows the plain sign talk, where you use your hands if you don't understand the language. By all means, they would have visited with Crow at the fort at some point in time. And I also think it's highly likely that at some point in time, Colter might have said, hey, I visited with you guys. Now tell me where the next village is. And it wouldn't have been unusual for someone, a warrior, a brave, a young man, to say, well, I'll show you, I'll take you there. Maybe I'll give you a horse, and when you get back home, or when we part ways, maybe you give me a gift, which would have been a logical thing to do. So in any case, I'm not so sure that Colter was suffering his way through the Yellowstone Plateau at that time. Historians do debate where he actually traveled on that journey in the winter of '07-'08. But for the most part, I'm not too concerned myself about the minor details. We do know that when Coulter eventually did go back to St. Louis and visited with his old captain, William Clark, we do know that William Clark added information to his map. We call it Clark's map of 1810. So in 1810, Coulter goes back east, he visits with Captain Clark, and tells him where he has been. And the information on that map is incredible. It literally shows the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River, what's likely Yellowstone Lake. Ordinal direction and relative distance is incredibly accurate on the William Clark map of 1810. And it's astonishing that John Coulter, who there's a very good chance couldn't read and write, told this information to William Clark several years, at least 2.5 years or so after he had seen it, told this information to William Clark and remembered relative distance, ordinal direction, and communicated it very accurately to William Clark. So John Coulter did go through Yellowstone. At the same time, I'm sure there were times where he's by himself, and the winter is a very harsh season. But again, it'd be foolish to not encamp with some natives, with some friends, when the weather was at its most dire. By all means, if you stay with a tribe, if you stay with a village, if you're friendly with them, this can be an asset in the future for purposes of trade, that's the point, but also just for your peace of mind. Food and shelter and company and sociability and hanging around with people. Humans are social animals. So to live with the natives would have been a great thing. At the same time that I kind of make it sound like Coulter wouldn't have done anything foolish, and perhaps it was a little easier because he was living with the natives and was attracted to them, I also don't want to minimize what this guy accomplished. Traveling through the Yellowstone Plateau region, Coulter was very close to the Continental Divide and may have even crossed it. Traveling through that region would be brutal winters. 4 or 5 feet of snow, temperatures well below zero were certainly possible and probable. In addition, imagine being one lone white man and you're walking up to an Indian encampment. And perhaps some half-wolf dogs come running out to greet you, and they're not necessarily friendly. You're a stranger. So this would be a difficult situation for me to imagine to negotiate. The typical thing to do is, as you approach the village and the dogs set up the alarm, would be to discharge your gun. My gun is empty. I come in peace. Maybe hold your hands up in a sign of welcome. And that could be a difficult situation when these dogs are coming, and then a whole bunch of people who don't know if you're a friend or an enemy in spite of your gestures, though they know they outnumber you, come galloping up on horses or running out and yelling, and they're carrying their weapons. And then, of course, you visit. Perhaps you lift your pipe, which often was carried around a man's neck on a thong. Lift your pipe and show them that you want to sit and counsel and smoke, which you always do when you visit. Sit and smoke in peace. Regardless, Coulter did travel through some part of what is now Yellowstone National Park, and we do see evidence of this on William Clark's map, and I take it for what it's worth. I take it as it's stated, and it really is an incredible journey. There is a spot on Clark's map where it shows boiling spring. So we know Coulter saw some thermal features, but based on the track that he outlined for Clark, very likely he saw multiple hot springs, and very likely he saw Yellowstone Lake and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And then, in the spring of 1808, he comes back to Fort Ramon at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone River. And Druryard returns, Lisa returns, Potts returns, and they all continue to trap the beaver. They all continue to capitalize on the beaver for